It's my pleasure to be here, and glad all of you are taking the time to participate in this. And so traditionally at the Evolution meeting, the editors of journals published by the Society do sort of an open question and answer forum, and it's primarily intended as a way to sort of let people see behind the curtain of what goes on at our journals with the review process. And so what I'm going to do to start off is give a really brief talk, I guess, about how we handle things at Systematic Biology. And the other panelists will jump in and point out areas that might be different between our process and their processes. So I am going to share my screen and load my slides up. And I think everyone should be seeing this now, is that correct? Okay, so we're good to go. So basically what I think is important to remember about the processes here is that all of us kind of come into science from the researcher standpoint and the author standpoint. And then at some point, many of us do editorial work, review work, and see the other end of this. And it's actually a really good way to understand what happens to your submission after you hit the submit button. And so, as I mentioned, journals are similar in a lot of ways, but they all have their unique aspects to them. And so Dan and Tracey and Max and John, please jump in and point out areas that differ between SysBio and the way that you guys do things. And so all of us are editors and sort of people who think about the content of the journal. We all work with other professionals who manage the actual submission process. And so for Systematic Biology, our managing editor, who is a woman named Jack Heron, will actually sort of initiate this process. After you hit your submit button, all the files are reviewed. We look for things like data accessibility statements and data archiving statements. We check to see that supplemental materials are accessible, and do sort of a minimal amount of pre-review checking to make sure all the information is there. The reason that this happens is that our reviewers are used to seeing these items and get very cranky if they're not available. So we're trying to help the authors at this stage. Once that's happened, I get an email in my box, and I'm notified by our managing editor that these the files are fine and that the submission is now ready to be considered. And so this usually happens to me throughout the day, and there are days when I hate to check my email notifications because I know I have like a bunch of things coming in. What I then do is I make time to read the submission letter and the abstract, and I select an associate editor to handle the submission. Usually, if someone suggests an associate editor or a couple of associate editors, I'll try to follow that suggestion, but it's not always possible. Our associate editors who do the real, sort of bulk of the editorial work, what they typically do at this point is they'll skim through the submission, give it a relatively quick read, and they'll make a list of potential reviewers who have expertise that covers subject matter in the submission. And it's very rare for any associate editor to have a completely complementary set of expertise in any submission. And so an editor who has a background in theory might want to make sure that they get reviewers who are more experienced with other aspects of the paper. But the goal is to find people who sort of cover the range of values. So Tracey, I think, wanted to say something.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to jump in just a little bit earlier, but I was muted, so I couldn't. But I was just going to say that part of the initial checking would include as well, for a journal that's doing double-blind review, would be checking that the manuscript is appropriately anonymized and has had the acknowledgements and all identifying features as far as is possible taken out. And the other thing I was wondering if anybody wanted to comment on is more or less at the stage 3 in Bryan's list here, is the possibility of the desk reject, which some journals do. So that might be worth talking about. So this is a stage whereby a manuscript may be rejected, sometimes on the basis of the editor-in-chief's decision, sometimes with the consultation with associate editors without being reviewed at all. And this would be a situation perhaps where a manuscript is well out of the remit of the journal, you know, it's just been sent to the wrong place, or there is something really wrong with it, there's a fundamental flaw. And the idea is to reduce reviewer and associate editor burden by not sending out something for review which is not going to be ultimately going to fare positively. That said, you know, journals that practice this, and for evolution it's probably about 25 to 30% of papers to which this happens. We do send very detailed feedback to authors. You know, we don't just send it back because we recognise the enormous amount of effort that has gone into, you know, any manuscript that's come to us. So we do provide suggestions and justify any such decision, and hopefully a kind of pointer direction to help the authors know where they might send it to, where it might receive a more positive outcome. Thanks.
So
I just wanted to interject really quickly. Right now what we're seeing is like the presenter version, and a couple of people have requested that we try and like have it as the full screen slide, just because it's hard to read. Is that possible?
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but
that is the
Bryan, if you go to, yeah, perfect.
Okay.
And then we also have a question here. Do all journals represented here anonymize in the same degree?
I'll jump in there and say that the American Naturalist went into double blind quite early, but we also don't require it. It's our default expectation. But we found that at this point, about a third of our submissions are also on bioRxiv. And any reviewer who does their due diligence is going to find that anyway and know who's doing it. And so we have almost everybody who has a bioRxiv preprint prefers to opt out because it's extra work to anonymize and they are not anonymous. And so we try not to require people to do the extra work of going through and redacting every citation to their own work that would identify them and redacting things that are findable with a Google search in about 5 seconds.
At Evolution Letters, we're only single blind, but it's something we're constantly reviewing whether or not to change that. But at the moment, we're only single blind.
And Evolution is double blind, and I think it's an interesting point because it's recognised that it's imperfect, with an increasing number of authors posting their manuscripts as well on bioRxiv. The property that Dan just mentioned, it's often not so hard for a reviewer to find out who the author is. So which you could say, well, then negates part of the advantages of double-blind review. So I think this is a problem, and it's an increasing problem as more authors post their manuscripts on bioRxiv. And I think I'd be interested in what people think, because, you know, I personally can see the benefits of double-blind review, but it's not the only kind of transparent, or it's not the only kind of reviewing process that's on the blog to try and increase transparency and decrease bias. Yeah, it's, you know, perhaps we can get into a discussion of that when we've been through some of the basic logistics, but I think it's an important problem to talk about.
And just to add to that, I mean, this will be even more of a problem if we encourage the authors to transfer their submissions onto bioRxiv, because then every submission potentially will be on bioRxiv, and that completely renders the double-blind review blind, not blind. So that will be a problem.
I will add briefly, I agree, there's a lot we could delve into here and we don't want to get too distracted. About a year ago, I did an analysis because MNAT has opt-out double blind. As I said, about a third of our authors opt out. They are not, the people who opt out are not predominantly senior white males, they're actually predominantly junior lead authors who are choosing bioRxiv that senior scientists are a little more skeptical of. So I was able to go through and look at the previous 500 acceptances and 500 declines and figure out the gender, well, infer as best I could the gender of the lead author and whether or not it was double blind or opt out. And what I found was that there was absolutely no gender bias at either level, blind or not blind, which was reassuring. In terms of the proportion, the likelihood a paper is accepted or not is unaffected by whether they're double blind. Unaffected by gender, but there is an effect of blinding. Blinded papers tend to be treated more harshly by reviewers than non-blind papers. And that was a pretty strongly significant effect. Which isn't to say that I'm advocating dropping double blind. It's just something I don't know what to do with, because I believe in double blind, but I'm not sure I'd recommend it to my students.
Okay, so maybe I'll just get going. Yeah, to circle back around to the comment that Tracey made about editorial rejections, we get a surprising number of submissions for a journal called Systems Biology, and apparently the authors confuse systems biology with systematic biology. So those are editorial rejections right away. And so check the name, I guess, of journals, right? Okay, so after AEs have gone through and made a list of potential reviewers, they will then invite this set of reviewers. What our AEs typically do is find 4 people to invite first, and then as declines come in, they will expand this list. Of course, some AEs are more aggressive about getting 3 reviews or you know, what they feel to be a sufficient number than others. And I know that this is often a process that can take a matter of weeks by the time you send invitations out and wait for responses and eventually get to the point where you have a sufficient number of reviewers who have agreed to review the paper. I imagine that this is something people at other journals have noticed too. Any comments there? Okay, so do
you want to say anything about suggested reviewers versus reviewers chosen by the associate editor?
Yeah, we get about 1/3 of our papers where authors will suggest reviewers. And a lot of our AEs will ask for a review from that person and then recognize that it's, you know, maybe should be considered a favorable review. You know, occasionally our authors will list a reviewer not to invite, but that's a relatively rare occurrence.
Maybe something it would be nice to talk about at some point is, you know, how we find reviewers and whether we're worried about at all about, you know, biases in who we choose as reviewers. And, you know, most journals have a database of reviewers which can be searched for on the basis of keywords and expertise and that kind of thing. Or associate editors may think of people they know, and you know that's something which can be useful. But obviously, we think of the people we know. We don't think of the people we don't know. But there are also, you know, some interesting initiatives, Diversify, EEB, and Early Career reviewer databases, which have databases of people who want to review and who aren't necessarily the people that you know, more senior associate editors might think of. So I think those are, you know, those are really important resources that are used by journals. So you know, we'll talk about later, I'm sure, about how to get involved in reviewing, because that's the best thing to do, get involved in reviewing papers and to get yourself onto one of those databases.
So we have a question right now from one of the attendees. One thing I've heard from my colleagues is that there's a shortage of reviewers. How much truth is there in that, and what are some of the reasons? And is it a dearth of experts or a reluctancy to invest time in the process? So I know, Tracey, you kind of commenting on getting on one of these lists to be a reviewer, but if you could talk about how hard it is to get a reviewer or 3 reviewers for a paper.
I'm sure we'll all have views on this, but there are two. Actually, an interesting thing is to think about how hard it is normally and whether it's got harder during the COVID pandemic. But our experience is most of the time it's fine, and but there are some papers that are very, very hard to find reviewers for, and there's a long tail where 6 to 8, 10 people are even invited, and everybody turns it down. So I don't find it especially hard, but there's a sort of difficult tail, and I don't know if that's a feature that other editors find. So I'd be interested in your views.
Absolutely, seeing the same thing. Typically, so when I get a paper coming back to me with an associate editor's recommendation, I see how many people were asked and how many reviews we got. We aim for 2 reviews at AmNat. We don't, some journals are doing 3 reviews. I worry a bit that 3 reviews is adding to the problem of scarcity of reviewers, so we tend to go with 2. Typically, we ask 3 to 4 people to get 2 reviews. Maybe a third of papers, we get the first 2 people we ask. But yeah, I think the record I've seen is maybe 11 or 12 invitations to get 2. Since COVID began, we've had trouble where we have an increasing number of people who agree to review and then never deliver. And we just keep asking and pestering them after a while. And they keep saying, I'll get to it next week, and they don't. And after some time, we just cut them off. And I've been doing more and more cases where we're rendering decisions with fewer reviews than we would like. And so the associate editors and I have to step in and do the work of the reviewer who failed to deliver. And that's been a lot of work recently. It's not many, but I'd say 2 or 3 times a week now I'm doing a decision where we're short a review.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that's what we're finding, but also I wanted to say that we do get it as editors, and we know that these are these are completely unprecedented times, and I would say a general feature of all of us probably is it's quite difficult for us to say, oh, I said I would do it, but actually I can't. And so this is just a plea to everybody. It's absolutely fine, even up to the point where you really, really thought you could do it and return a review, and then you can't because, life is just too complicated, either now or at any time, and we're fine with that. So, we are all taking steps to mitigate the extraordinary circumstances that we find ourselves in now.
We have another quick question. Is there a higher acceptance rate with suggested reviewers?
We find that to be really bimodal. Sorry.
Yeah, go on, Bryan.
So we find that to be really bimodal. Some of the suggested reviewers are glowing, and it's like your mom is writing the review. And then probably at least a third are just the harshest things you've ever seen. And there never seems to be a middle ground with suggested reviewers. So.
I'd agree with that. I think often people have an assumption that suggested reviewers are going to be kinder on a manuscript, but often they're the most perceptive and rigorous, and possibly because they know the field so well, maybe identify things that a reviewer that wasn't a suggested reviewer might have missed.
I'm guessing that maybe 10 or 20% of the papers, the associate editor actually uses a suggested reviewer. I think oftentimes AEs are a little skeptical that somebody's getting an academic friend who's going to be friendly to them to do it. I agree with Bryan that that's not necessarily going to happen, but I do think in general those suggestions are useful to us, but not often acted on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, I haven't yet done the analysis, which is something that I wanted to do. But my overwhelming impression is that if we do use preferred reviewers, they are harsh. You know, they're on the harsher side. So, which is kind of interesting, and it may well be to do with the you know, the sort of greater range, depth of expertise that John mentioned.
Yeah, so moving on then, our process is 2 to 3 weeks after a reviewer accepts, we send an email reminding them that their review is due. And in most cases, we'll get reviews back in a relatively timely manner, and the AE will then be able to make a decision about the manuscript after looking at the reviews. And our process for this is we ask the AE to, once they get the reviews, to read the reviews and then read the paper again more carefully and write up a recommendation to the editor-in-chief. Our reviewers are asked to make a recommendation, so we have recommendations from the reviewers to the AE that then ideally are synthesized into a recommendation to the editor-in-chief. And I think this is a little different at different places, so maybe people want to jump in and talk a little bit about what their AEs are asked to do when they get reviews back.
I think, sorry, I think for evolution, it's pretty much as you say. The associate editor would you know, read the reviews, provide a synthesis, integrate those views, and provide their own sort of recommendation. Anything extra, you know, make sure that the reviewers have fully addressed the sort of key criteria for the journal. You know, is it novel, is it important, is it in advance, that kind of thing. So I think it's essentially, as you said, for us.
Okay. And then once that happens, I will be notified again, and I read the recommendation from the AE. Usually I glance over the reviews. I probably don't read them as carefully as the associate editors do. And typically that's when I'll actually read the submission. The degree to which I read it carefully is very much a function of what the associate editor says, right? And so if it looks like a manuscript that has potential to be accepted at some point, this is something that I will, you know, pay close attention to. If it's a manuscript that seems to fall well outside of the scope of the journal, according to the reviewers or the associate editor, I'll at least want to verify that I agree with this opinion. And so I see my role as editor-in-chief as kind of smoothing out the variance across reviews and across the associate editors, and maintaining consistency and quality in the journal, and also to make sure that the process is fair to everyone. You know, not every paper gets accepted, but we really want to make sure that every paper is handled in as fair of a way as it can be.
And sorry, so there were quite a few questions that were submitted about reviews that are not very friendly, not very constructive. Maybe we should say something about quality control of reviews. So as an associate editor, I've never sent back a review for revision, but do you do that? In the sense of sending it back to the reviewer to say this is not constructive enough or this is not friendly enough?
I did that a week ago. It's very rare. I'd say that the vast majority of the reviews we get are very constructive and friendly, but I feel like one of my roles and one of the roles as the associate editors is to keep an eye out for things that are poorly worded, let's say. And every now and then we catch one where the reviewer hasn't had their coffee and they're grumpy, and we have no obligation to. Judy Bronstein was editor-in-chief of AmNap before me, and she said, Dan, when you enter this role, remember it's not a democracy where you're tallying up votes. Right? The reviews and the associate editor's comments are recommendations. You take them under advisement. You can go back and override them if they are unreasonably hypercritical, or if they miss something that is crucial. And part of that involves going back and dealing with tone. I never change the tone of a review without checking with the reviewer first. I always say, this was inappropriately phrased. Can I rephrase it, or would you be willing to rephrase it? And whenever I've done that, I always get back an apologetic email from the reviewer saying, oh, I'm sorry, I really didn't think that it would be misconstrued that way. That's not what I meant. And it's always worked out fine, and they learn something about their phrasing in the process.
Yeah, I'd sort of second that. I mean, I think if it's not something that needs to be changed, or there's a kind of comment from a reviewer which has been made, but is based on a mispremise, or isn't really anything that anyone sort of agrees should be done, you know, the other editor, it might be a case to say, reviewer 2 says this, but you know, this is deemed less important than other comments, or there may be another way for you to address it, or maybe you just want to you know, address the comment rather than make the change. So you can, you know, if there's something in there which isn't you know, doesn't necessarily need rewording, but is not a change that has a sort of majority view, that's something which you can also indicate. And you know, as Dan says, it's very rare, I think, nowadays, you know, for reviews to come in that are on the less professional side. That's fairly rare. I've only known of one case where you know, a review had to have been rescinded because it was inappropriate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I can think of one that I've done in a year and a half that was just so clearly over the line that it was not constructive.
And I should clarify, we're not getting things that are really over the line. We're getting things where a reviewer in a long review, somewhere in there, the reviewer says, this is a really terrible example of a sloppy abstract. It's like, okay, you don't need to use those superlatives. You could just say the abstract could be written more clearly or something like that. So, you know, it's a matter of usually pretty subtle adjustments to tone, just to avoid, you don't have to offend or upset in order to get your point across.
I agree totally with that. And you know, we will, again, probably later come to whether, you know, reviews should be, well, double-blinded, single-blinded, open, or whatever the rest of it. I think a useful thought experiment to do for yourself when you're writing a review is, you know, even if you are anonymous with respect to the authors, would you put your name to it if you know, in another circumstance? And if the answer is, if you would write the review differently according to whether you think you would put your name on it at the end or not, then something needs to change. So I think that's a really useful thought experiment to do, because, you know, I find if I wouldn't put my name to it, then I haven't written it right. I've been a bit on the abrupt side, or I'm a bit too fast, or been a bit too, you know, it's the first digest of what I think rather than the integration of the professional review. So I think that's quite an important thing to do, regardless of whether you are anonymous or not.
That said, real quickly, the only time I'm remembering now one pretty negative, seriously negative review that was over the line, and they did sign their name to it. So as a counterpoint to Tracey's, I think sometimes it's when the person does sign their name to it that they're really being can be particularly brusque sometimes. I don't know the psychology behind it, and maybe it's just the individual.
So
Sorry, I was just gonna sort of interject with a question. Someone had asked if the proportion of student reviewers is increasing and whether that's good or bad. And then I'm just gonna read the rest of the question. As it seems a double-edged sword as students are becoming experts, but at the same time, it's great to have experience in the peer review process. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I'm sure that the number of student reviewers is going up because many journals, including Evolution, has an explicit desire to mentor people into this process, and so actually ask reviewers to offer the opportunity to review this manuscript with somebody in their lab, and there's an explicit part to say whether they've done so. And so, you know, that has brought a lot of, you know, otherwise how do you get into it? You know, so I think it's not only something which is sort of informally encouraged, it's an explicit move to get that done within publishing. So I don't know if other editors wanted to comment on that.
I think it's very often the case that our early career reviewers write some of the best reviews, certainly some of the most detailed reviews, and that's particularly if it's a fairly technical paper and it's in a fast-moving field. Often it's the early career researchers that are most up to date on you know, cutting-edge methods or approaches. So a more experienced reviewer might write something more generally relevant, that, you know, a more general overview of the paper, but they may not know the subtleties of some of the methods involved, for example. So often that combination of experience and you know, somebody who's right at the coalface at the moment works very well from an editor's perspective.
That is certainly my experience, particularly with technical sides of the papers we get. Senior grad students or postdocs often are writing the best reviews that we get.
I'll third that or fourth that, and then also say if you want to get involved in reviewing, one way to do it is not to send emails to us, the editors, because we don't choose the reviewers typically. But if there's an associate editor who works in your area of expertise for a journal that you would like to review for, it's okay to contact that associate editor and say, hey, if you get a paper in that I would be appropriate for, I'd love to be a reviewer for you. There are some online databases for this, but then you rely on the AE to go to the database instead of going to the database in their head of people they know. So talk to somebody who is an AE who would be likely to send you things relevant to your area of work, or talk to your PI if you're a student or postdoc, and ask them to shunt off, to recommend you if they can't review things, or better yet, if they're willing to co-review things with you. That's a great way to do that.
I was just going to make the same as that last point, and in particular, when somebody is too busy to review a paper themselves, or not able to for whatever reason, they're nearly always encouraged to recommend reviewers. So if you're, you know, if for example it's your PI or just someone who you've met who works in your field, they're going to remember your name as someone who's keen to review and has expertise. So, you know, just let relevant people know that you're keen to get that experience.
Okay, so we'll move on. The next step of the process is sort of the culmination of the review process is the editor will then make a decision on the manuscript, and at least at Systematic Biology, I will write a decision letter that will highlight parts of the reviews or the associate editor's comments that are sort of most relevant in the decision-making process. This is, I think, the part where it's really important for me to try to make sure that everything is handled fairly, and also that we're being as consistent as we can across the 30 or 40 associate editors that are going to make decisions on manuscripts throughout the course of a year. And it's often, I think, a part that is, you know, challenging too for the authors when they get this, which is of course the next step. And I know from, you know, being an author also, that it's often feels like it might be reading tea leaves or something, you know, so the editor needs to write the decision letter in such a way that reflects what people have thought about the paper, and also, you know, lets the author know if a resubmission is possible, and if so, what would need to happen for a resubmission to potentially be successful. But of course, it's very difficult for an editor to say, if you do X, the reviewers and AE will absolutely love it and, you know, recommend that a resubmission should be published or something like that. So if it feels like it's a little lawyerly, I think this is a necessary thing in the sense that we want to trust the review process, and if that means that we're allowing a resubmission, then we also have to give the associate editor and the reviewers chances to reevaluate and weigh in on that resubmission.
I'll add a caveat there that we encourage our AEs to try and reach a decision on that resubmission without having to bother the reviewers again if they feel competent to do so. That speeds things up and for everybody, except the AE.
At our journal, at least, we try to, if we do invite a resubmission, to send it back to the same AE. This is not always possible for various reasons. It's been particularly difficult in the last several months because many of our AEs are involved with important work related to the pandemic, either in their home countries or their institutions, and have asked for time off or leaves of absence. And you know, this is obviously more important in a sense, and so it's something that we would honor with that. But that's certainly ideally what would happen. And then the last thing that happens at Systematic Biology is once we get to the point where everyone agrees that a paper should be published, I'll either ask the associate editor or I will go through and try to edit the final version for grammatical consistency and, you know, just wording issues in order to tighten stuff up. Usually our papers are well written at first, and as they get revised, things sometimes get worked in with the revision process where the tense changes mid-paragraph or something like this, and it's just often the last thing we want to double check. And then the paper is accepted and, you know, published online in a matter of weeks, and very later eventually will appear in an issue. You know, that might take 6 months or so.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the point 12 and 13 really. I mean, it was also raised, I think, in one of the questions from the audience submitted ahead of time. It's the issue about authors for whom English is not their first language, and you know, many papers, most papers, nearly all papers are very well written, but there is a you know, there is an issue of which we are aware to do with advertent or inadvertent you know, formation of a view about a behaviour because it's not written in the way that you might like, and so, you know, extra difficulties that are perceived to get in the way of the science because of the writing and the way that they are referred to in comments. And so I think it is something which all journals are aware of and are trying to assist. And I know that many of the publishers as well are offering now extra support for authors, so author services from which authors can draw on to try to improve the clarity in the language of their manuscript, so that doesn't become sort of caught up in the scientific evaluation of the paper. So, you know, I will always try to edit manuscripts for you know, for clarity and assist. And I think, you know, what we do is hopefully seen in a positive light. But you know, I don't know if other editors would like to make any comments on this, but, you know, it's an issue and we're aware of it and we're trying to tackle it.
There is, in my role as editor, I don't actually edit text of manuscripts once they're accepted. There is when the paper goes through the proof stage, there is a team that look at them and help with that. That's after it's kind of left my desk, so I'm not exactly sure of all of the process involved there. The other thing is reviewers are some reviewers will do quite a lot of pointing out grammatical mistakes and others won't. So sometimes things get flagged up during the review process. So I think there is quite a bit of variation in journals about how much editing in the if you like, traditional sense of editing editor-in-chiefs do.
And I think the real problem is if papers that are harder to read are somehow penalized in the review process, because reviewers are less patient to work through it. I think that is the real problem, because that is at the first stage of submission, and authors would not have access to editing services which might be offered by the journals to accepted manuscripts, and so it's somehow on them to find a solution and find editors or proofreaders among their friends and colleagues.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think that's an important point. And like everybody here, you know, we look at the rejection rates, submission rates, and the acceptance rates of manuscripts that are submitted from all over the world, from wherever we receive submissions, and where we have a sort of higher, where there's variation in that, we are trying to address whether, you know, what is at the basis of that, and is there any of the any potential for the kind of bias that Max was just talking about. You know, and I was very struck by the link to the blog that we were sent in the sort of preparatory material, which is reviewers don't be rude to non-native English speakers. And so that, you know, there's some important stuff in there. So, you know, so I guess this is why, you know, we're also talking to our publisher, Wiley, you know, what can we do to provide support so that we can minimize the kind of problem that Max was referring to.
Okay, so I'll just wrap a couple things up here. And I titled this Things to Remember. So this process is largely dependent on volunteer labor, and it amazes me every day that it works as well as it does. You know, lots of people can find lots of ways to criticize the peer review process, and these are justified. But at the same time, it's remarkable that this can function as well as it does. I think one of the things that I've really, you know, it's easy to hear that, you know, you should be polite when you, you know, are dealing with these types of submission processes and review and response to reviews. But when you're an editor, you really see the full range of politeness or impoliteness that people have. And it's almost inevitably the case that, you know, if you can, even if you're frustrated with something, you want to be as decent about it as possible, and it'll help you in the long run. You know, when you submit papers, I think it's a great idea to submit AE or to suggest particular AEs and reviewers. We tend to encourage people to justify this. And so if you say, this person would be an excellent reviewer because they're very experienced with these methods that we use in our paper, and, you know, these methods are new enough that a lot of people don't have that experience, that helps me and helps our associate editors. And then we haven't talked about pre-submission inquiries yet, but because most journals have manuscript categories, it's important to think about the category that you're submitting. And if you have a question about that, this is often a great time to send a quick email to myself or another editor and say, this is the paper I'd like to submit. I think it's a good fit for this category. Do you agree with that? And then we already touched on this point about reviewing, but smart grad students, if you have, you know, a dissertation planned out and think that it would be really amazing to get chapters 2, 3, and 4 of your dissertation published in Evolution, SysBio, and MNAT, email associate editors and try to review for these journals before you submit your paper. It will really, you know, do a lot of good in the long run. So that is all that I have.
So we have a bunch of great questions coming in from our audience. So the one, go ahead, Max.
Just say one more thing as a pre-print editor, is that this whole, if you put your paper onto bioRxiv, then this whole process might be preceded by an email from me or somebody like me at another journal who sift through bioRxiv and pick out manuscripts that we think fit our journal, and email authors and invite them to consider our journals for submission. But from then on, the whole process is exactly as we have talked through now.
So Max, this is a great question that has been upvoted a whole bunch. Are there situations where preprint will count against a paper during the review process, especially in cases where the preprint has gone through several iterations of improvements?
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised. I mean, I think if you submit your paper, then it will be evaluated as it is. And I don't think that the history of the paper will normally would matter a lot. I mean, if this has gone through iterations on the bioRxiv, I mean, then probably it's a better paper now than it used to be before, or hopefully that is the case. But I don't think that anybody would really hold that against you. But maybe one of the editors would like to say something about that.
I guess there is the potential for reviewers having unconscious bias against the paper if they look it up on bioRxiv and seen it's been through several iterations. They may think, oh, it's been to several journals already and been rejected. Perhaps that may not be the case, of course, but they could get that perception. But then I think you're right that there are also advantages of doing it. For example, you may get approached by people like yourself, or it may be that your manuscript has just been improved during that process, so that when you submit it to the next journal, it would have already had a lot of those problems ironed out.
I've heard another argument about preprint caution, which is that you're not necessarily putting your best foot forward. When you submit a paper to a journal, we do several rounds of review, which is a closed internal process to try and get your paper to be as good as it can possibly be before the wider world sees it. And if there's a logical flaw, experimental design flaw, analytical flaw in the paper, and you put it on bioRxiv, you're putting that work out for the whole public to see, and that can potentially be embarrassing. And so I think part of the purpose of review as journals practice it is quality control for what we publish. But the mirror image of that quality control is we're trying to help you out with getting your paper to be as good as it can be before it reaches a wide audience. And preprints step over that process. And I have seen it come back and bite people. And so, yeah, do I have my students put up preprints? Sometimes I do, but it's something to be cautious of.
We have another question here. What do you expect to see in a cover letter? Like what specific information on the paper or the science? And we kind of touched on this already. So reviewer recommendations, I'm not going to talk about, but if you could just kind of talk about this cover letter that we're supposed to write for each of our papers, what do you want in it?
I think a cover letter, I mean, I guess it's a good idea to have it not just replicate the abstract. So don't do that. Although having said that, that's where I usually start from. You know, what am I going to put in my cover letter? Oh, what's in my abstract? Because I spent ages on that, you know, and I cut and paste it across. That's not it really. So it's trying to highlight, you know, what is the, you know, what is the question? What is the hypothesis? You know, why is it interesting and important? Why should the readership of the journal be interested in it? I think those are the kinds of key things. I don't know if I've missed anything. I'm sure if I have, others can step in.
I mean, I personally really like it when a cover letter says, you know, this work is important for these reasons. And I don't always have to agree with that, but it helps me think about both how it fits in the journal and which AE might be the most interested in the paper, or the most, you know, sort of qualified at giving a response to that. And so I can read the abstract, but giving me sort of a subjective opinion about why you think the paper matters is something I find really useful.
So MNAT maybe is a minority here. We don't require cover letters. In fact, we don't encourage cover letters. Some people provide them anyway, but our attitude is that if you're not able to clearly convey why the work is broadly relevant in the abstract and in the introduction and discussion, then you haven't done your paper right. And so I read, whenever a paper comes in, I read the abstract and I read at the very least the intro and discussion before I decide whether to send it on or not. If I'm not able to get that out of the paper itself, then the paper is not ready to go out anyway. And so I really avoid, even when somebody does provide a cover letter against our instructions, I tend not to use it because I like to really evaluate the paper based on the paper.
I think that's very, very interesting perspective and worth bearing in mind for what should be in your abstract. I think. The other thing to note is that it's not just a cover letter. So depending upon which journal you're submitting to, some of them require a significant statement or 50 words about why your paper is important, or 300 words about why your paper is important. And also it's worth saying that, I mean, we're sort of focusing here on the journals that we are editors for, but the cover letter can mean a very different thing, you know, if you're submitting to Nature. So there, it's a you know, that's the thing which is going to decide whether your paper gets reviewed or not, and it has a particular format which you need to follow. So bear in mind that the cover letter can mean very different things depending upon which journal you're submitting to, or may not even be required at all, as we just heard from Dan.
Just while we're on the subject of cover letters, I'm amazed at how often we receive cover letters where the letter has got the wrong journal in the letter, which seems ridiculous, but people quite often send the manuscript to Journal A, it gets rejected, they then send it to Journal B and forget to change the name. They keep the same cover letter.
It hurts
I guess always proofread. So the next sort of like highest voted question is, what is the best way to handle rejections that due to reasons that were not true to your submission, e.g. you tried to make XYZ claims, but you had a paragraph stating these are merely hypotheses for future readers? Is rebutting, politely of course, such an instance considered rude?
I'd say that's very context dependent. In general, I encourage review authors to stand up for their opinions on something. If a review or AE or editor is off base on something, we should be as open to correction on that as the authors are. That said, there are cases where authors want to contest things unreasonably. There are places where reviewers dig their heels in, and part of the role of the editor is to be this third party and adjudicate. And there's been one instance where I've gotten involved in adjudicating this battle between a reviewer and an author who signed, the reviewer signed their review, and it became very personal, and I ended up being CC'd on email after email once in 3 years. That was not helpful. But by and large, yeah, I look at every appeal that comes in. I don't say they're all successful, but I think it's absolutely worthwhile. If you think that an error was made or there's a valid difference of opinion, yeah, stand up for yourself.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, I mean, in answering the question, it's not considered rude at all. I mean, if you have a valid reason. So the thing is to focus on, you know, material misunderstandings or factual errors. And if that's happened, then, you know, you should be able to write that down. Or a criticism, you know, your question seems to be referring to something which sometimes happens. There's a criticism made of a sort of field or of a technique that is actually outside the paper that's being reviewed, and that sometimes reflects the you know, views of the reviewer rather than what's in actually the paper. And if that's happened and you can point it out, then it will be looked at. Of course it will. And you know, as Bryan said, you know, these are we're human beings, you know, making best judgment that we can, and sometimes errors will be made, and so we are open to having that pointed out and considering it.
I mean, I think it's worth, there's sort of two types of things that go into a decision at systematic biology, and I imagine in most journals. One is, you know, is the science in the paper technically correct and done in the best way possible? You know, and then there's sort of this technical level. And hopefully that's entirely based on, you know, things that we can verify. And if you gave the paper to a whole suite of different people, you would reach the same conclusion about the technical merits. You know, this is why we require data archiving, and we ask that scripts are uploaded and these types of things. There's also this other layer of how important is the work, and it's much more subjective. And it's the one that I think is the hardest for me personally to evaluate, and it's often the hardest for the reviewers and the AEs to evaluate. And of course, this is where an experience that someone has as an author is likely to be very different than what they would have as a reviewer. As an author and as a PI of a lab, I think that everything my students ever do is subjectively really valuable and important, right? But of course, everyone doesn't agree with me, you know, and sometimes we submit papers to journals that are good journals and they say, it's fine technically, but not that exciting, you know, and this is the harder part, I think, to argue with. If you're an author and you get a decision that says the work is technically fine, but we don't think it's important enough to publish, it, you know, I can empathize with this, but it's also harder to sort of appeal that decision, I think.
Yeah, unless you, from the review, can see that the reviewers have somehow misunderstood the implications of your findings. And in that case, I think you can make that point. But it is a much harder thing to argue than technical aspects, as Bryan says.
So kind of going along with that, one of their questions is what strategies or support are in place for early career scientists who belong to historically underrepresented minorities, in particular when silverbacks are obstructing and do not see beyond their own research. It's hard as an early career researcher, and we don't want to burn bridges, but we're also always afraid that the editor will side with that reviewer, and often we can feel powerless to argue.
So I'm assuming here this is an early career author rather than someone talking from a reviewing perspective. I mean, I think I'd like to think that most editors would take any appeal process on its merits, regardless of rank or status. Of course, that's a very hard thing to quantify, but I think if you feel that you have a strong case, you should do it. I don't think I'd like to think there won't be repercussions for it. You know, like I say, of course, it's hard to measure that. Certainly, you know, those of us in the editor's seat, I think would not. You know, I'm certain none of us would, you know, take a review less seriously just because one of the reviewers was a silverback. I certainly wouldn't. I'm sure the others are the same. What I would say as an early career researcher is it's always worth, before you go through that process, not least to save yourself time, is consult other people in, you know, whose opinions you trust about whether it's got a reasonable chance of being a successful appeal or not. Because, you know, you don't want to waste your own time or anyone else's if your colleagues whose opinions you trust are going to say to you, no, I think the reviewers or editors have a reasonable point here and you're unlikely to be successful. But, you know, I don't think you should feel intimidated into doing it if you feel you have a strong case just because you're an early career researcher. I hope you don't.
I wasn't sure whether this was a question that was sort of particularly focused about this issue of you know, appeals and rebuttals, or whether it was a more general question about strategies and support in place for early career scientists from underrepresented groups. So if it's sort of broader than what John's already said, I mean, I think this is one of the this is one of the issues to do with the nature of reviewing. So the pros and cons of single blind versus double blind is to sort of take away the perception of where, you know, who's written a manuscript, where it comes from, in a particular part of the world. So, so you know, that's a consideration here. I mean, there are lots of other people thinking about this, all sorts of tools for transparency that people are looking at and that we've all signed up to, that are in the sort of, you know, what journals sign up to, open science framework and those kinds of things which come into this. So I don't, you know, just in case that it was a sort of broader thing, some, you know, that's very much what is on editors and journals and publishers' minds when they're talking about the nature of reviewing.
Along those lines, there's also a question about, do you think it's within the reviewer's purview to comment on structure, style, and grammar? How should these be balanced in the review in contrast with comments on the science substance? And then someone actually added another question under that and said, could we hear more about what is generally expected from a reviewer? So it's sort of a two-part question.
I mean, I personally, and I think our AEs feel the same way, we want to know both about the technical side of the paper and then also the writing part of it. And very often, you know, if the writing is getting in the way of the technical part, we'll have reviewers comment on that, and they'll say, you know, I really think this is a strong paper, but it's really hard to decipher because of these, you know, the way it's written, or maybe the figures aren't very clear, or maybe the order of things and the methods is confusing, or, you know, whatever this looks like. And so as a reviewer, we want to hear about both sides of that. And that doesn't mean that every misspelled word needs to be pointed out. So oftentimes a reviewer will say, there's a lot of grammatical errors, for example, and they'll list a couple, you know, but you don't necessarily, I don't think, have to be obligated to find every potential issue.
But it's probably also the case that at least for the initial submission, it shouldn't be, or shouldn't have much or no weight at all in the decision whether what happens to this manuscript. I mean, I think ideally you wouldn't want to penalize papers for grammatical mistakes, basically, at this stage. I mean, if then you go through the revisions and you see that actually it doesn't really improve, and you have doubts whether the authors actually take your comments seriously, then I think it might play a role, but ideally in the beginning it wouldn't.
Up to a point, but I would say that if the grammar and writing make it unappealing to read, then it's a turnoff to the reviewers. It can do either of two things. Bad writing can just make it a slog to get through and not grab the reader. And that's cosmetic, but it's essential if you want to make something that people are excited to read, and they start reading and they're sucked into it. They don't want to put it down. That's the hallmark of a good paper. It has to be well written to do that. The worst case scenario is it's badly written enough that it makes it difficult to understand what was done or why, or what was uncovered in the process. And if you can't understand what was done or found, then it's equivalent in severity to a technical error. So one is like the window dressing of, is it an attractive place that draws you in? And the other is, can you understand what's going on once you're there? And both of those are about writing quality and style. And our job as editors and reviewers is to find the diamond in the rough and help authors shape that into something really crystalline and sharp. But if you have a diamond that's well hidden inside a bunch of mud, to extend that metaphor too much, reviewers are going to get really upset. And I've seen reviewers just throw up their hands and say, I can't read this. And I got halfway through and it was so hard to read, I gave up. And that's not quite their job. They really should get all the way through it and give you, the author, all of the feedback you need to make it better. but you could have the best idea in the world, and if it's causing that reaction in reviewers, you've done yourself a disservice.
Tracey, welcome back. Tracey's computer died, but she's back. So here's a question, kind of being a EIC seems like a lot of work, and obviously we're all juggling a lot right now. So how do you as an editor balancing your editing duties with your other scientific work? You're mentoring students, you're having a life outside of science, hopefully. So how are you balancing all these things? Or are you not balancing them right now? Is nobody balancing them right now?
So I would say for me, it probably takes up about 20% of my work time. One of the things I did do to balance that was I reviewed less for other journals once I took on the EIC role at Evolution Letters. And I also resigned from the editorial board of Molecular Ecology, which I was an associate editor of. So there was some balancing done before I started. I waited until doing a role like this until my children were, I mean, they haven't quite left school yet, but they're approaching that age. So they're more independent than when they were younger. So that's helped. I started a role when my research group was relatively small. It's like most people, my research group has, gone up and down in terms of numbers over the years. It was relatively small at the time I took on the role. So that helped. And the other thing I think has probably helped me is that by being a new journal, we still get relatively few submissions compared to more established journals. So that makes the workload easier to manage. How some of the other guys do it, I don't know, because they have more papers to deal with than me, I think.
I struggle every day to find some balance. I mean, it's, I'm doing this. Someone had asked in one of the questions, why would you do this to yourself? That's how I read it. It wasn't worded that way. But all of us, I think, are really invested in our professional societies. And we're doing this because we believe that scientific societies like ASN or SSE or SSB have a really important role to play in the publication landscape and ecosystem. And so for me, it's service, and I'm lucky enough to have a chair who's a systematic biologist, and he has let me off of a lot of work in my department that I would otherwise be doing because I took on this role. And so that's helped a great deal. So this is John Freudenstein. Thank you, John, if you're out there. But it's a challenge. It's an important job, and I'm very glad to be doing it, and I will very glad to be done doing it, in 18 months when my term is up.
So I said no twice before I agreed to do this. And I'd say it's been one of the most rewarding things I've done. It gives me that bird's eye view of the discipline that I had towards the end of graduate school when I had read so many things. And then I stopped having time to do that. And now it's reestablished that bird's eye view again, which is great. It has some huge rewards. There's just I'd say MNAT in particular, because it's a very old journal. It's 150 years old. That appeals to me personally. But also I get to read, I have to choose the winner of the Student Paper Award every year. And so the editors read all of the papers published by student first authors. It's about half of the papers in the journal each year. And we pick one and a couple of runners up, and that's just a joy reading all of these great papers. There are downsides for sure. I have to be super efficient with my time. There's a lot of things that, that sort of water cooler chit chat doesn't happen. I'm in, I'm out, I do what I need to do. I am much slower to get my students. I'd say my students bear the brunt of this because I'm slower. I used to be the person who gave comments on manuscripts back to my students and postdocs within 72 hours, and that is not true now. I submit fewer grants in the past couple of years. And there are costs as well in terms of just working later at night and there's some ugly things that come up. You know, the occasional battle between reviewer and author that happened once. That was not fun. And dealing with some issues of scientific integrity that have come up there have been a couple of instances where we've had to deal with some problems. And those are ongoing, and I won't comment further about them, but that took up a vast amount of time.
Just to follow up on that, I think I wouldn't say that I have any sort of balance, but you know, a lot of what is done is integrated, and I do think you know, I've sort of integrated this into all aspects of what I'm doing, because it's an ongoing task that never stops. And of course, each of us probably does it differently. And so you can pick off bits of editorial work every day, or you can store it all up for a, you know, for a joyous session on a Saturday or over the weekend or whatever. But I do think, you know, the benefits far outweigh any cost, because of the, you know, I partly took this up because, you know, I love the journal. I wanted to do, I love the society, you know, to try to attract papers that you know, will get in and make some money for the society as well, to promote all of the things that scientific and learned societies want to do. You know, I think that's an important point to think about when you're thinking about where to send your papers. Yeah, so love the journal, but wanted to read more science and wanted to read more broadly, because one ends up, you know, a bit sort of canalized, you know, doing this and the pressures of, you know, writing grants, writing papers, you know, one can get a bit sort of narrow. And it's certainly been wonderful from that point of view, the ability to sort of try to see who's doing the most exciting research, where is it, what's happening, and what are the new developments, what are the new techniques. So it's really, really good. But in terms of, you know, whether there's sort of work-life balance, well, you know, and I've never been any good at that. So I wouldn't really say that I have that sorted at all.
I have 2 young kids. I don't work on weekends when they're awake. So yeah, it is possible. We can do it. I'd say my estimate is it's probably 15 to 20 hours a week of work as editor. So I just compress everything else accordingly and work once my kids are asleep. So I have lots of time parenting, which is great.
I just wanted to add as well, though, I don't want this to kind of put people off these roles, because I know, you know, having talked to, you know, to people and talked about what, you know, what the kind of, you know, what's an average day, what's an average week of somebody who does the sort of job, academic job plus editing job that I have. You know, one of my postdocs then told me afterwards that she was really depressed, you know, and that wasn't the impression that I'd meant to create at all, because, you know, it does get managed, and it is important to, you know, you can do all of this stuff and have you know, a sensible balance. So I don't, you know, and I think it's important not to create a negative impression that you can only do this if you work really hard and work silly hours, and that's not what I mean to say at all. So just wanted to add that.
Okay, our next question, it says, I know this can vary a lot, but what is the typical amount of time for a paper to go through the entire review process? In other words, for a successful paper. Or what do you consider should be the ideal amount of time? And then this person has said that they've seen some recent tweets showing that certain papers took 10 years to go through the peer review process, and some papers that take 2 years. And then the second part of the question is that if it's taking so long, can we email the editor to ask what the status of the paper is?
Those real tail distributions make a big impact and a big impression, but they're certainly the minority. And if a paper took 10 years to get published from first submission, probably because it spent 9.5 years on the author's plate, getting more data. They didn't have time to deal with it. It's when you see time from first submission to being in print, keep in mind that often a majority of that time is time that it's in the author's court, so to speak.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add, sort of typical time to first decision is something, well, several weeks, a month, 30 days, 35 days sort of for a lot of, for a lot of journals, and journals have done a lot to try and bring that down. And also then after that, if it's a simple decision, then post-production, that will be the time that it then takes the paper to get into print or to get out onto a sort of first look, website where people can look at it if it's not already out on bioRxiv. So that's sort of typically it. But there is a long tail, and the long tail are the complicated papers that that where the whole thing is submission, a resubmission, and then maybe another, something still isn't quite right. And you can see how that would take a long time. And that's a combination of what's in the journal's hands, but also, as was just said, what the length of time it takes a bunch of revisions to be done. And we're also, very flexible. If you need more time to do the revisions that you've been asked to do, that's something where you can ask, and we will. Well, I've never said no. I've always said yes. So that's worth asking. And the other thing is, the question was, yes, of course you can ask where your paper is and what's happened to it. Please do. If you think it's been too long, just go ahead, and we will respond. We have surveillance. Every journal has a surveillance for trying to pick up where papers have got stuck somewhere because somebody is no longer able to review, or something else has happened. But we don't pick up everything, and so it's perfectly possible and acceptable for you to ask. So please do.
I went while people were talking and found data because we just got a report from our publisher about this. And so our average time to a desk rejection, these are papers that are not sent out to review, it was 10 days for 2019. And for papers that were sent out to review, the decision happened between 60 and 80 days for 95% of those papers. So that's 2 to 3 months, I think, is a good number to remember for systematic biology. And like others have said, if it's been 3 months and you've heard nothing, then I would certainly welcome reaching out, and that can be looked into.
The caveat being that during COVID, there's delays for reviewers, for AEs. I normally monitor not just how long papers are out in review, but how long papers are sitting on associate editors' desks. And I have a form letter that I modify a bit, and I email each AE. I get a dump of emails once a week at midnight saying, here are all of the AEs who are being slow right now, and I'll send them each a personal email. I used to do that at 2 weeks, because we really want them to give us the recommendations in under a week. 2 weeks is pushing it. Right now, I'm letting it go longer than that because I'm trying to be humane during COVID. We've had AEs lose family members to the virus. We've had AEs completely drop all of their normal work and go do modeling. We've had AEs who had COVID. We have AEs who are basically full-time parents and then some right now. So now it's fine to email the journal office and ask. Just be aware that things are going to take longer right now, and we're trying to be humane towards everybody at all stages of the manuscript process.
Just one thing to add is that once a manuscript has been accepted and gone into production, then editors can generally do not very much about things that are delayed in production. There shouldn't be delays in production, but I think there is variation between publishers and journals about how long it takes from a manuscript being accepted to how long it appears either online early or in a volume. So if there are problems there, by all means contact the editor, but usually what will happen is the editor will have to contact the production people, and they will be the people that deal with it. And actually, certainly for the journal I'm involved in, that personal link between pre-production and post-production is rather limited. I don't know the people that are involved in the production side, partly because Evolution Letters is published by Wiley, which is a very big operation. So in general, I think you'll find that when there are delays, we'll be able to help a lot more readily with manuscripts before a decision has been made, before they've been accepted, than after they've been accepted. obviously we try and help you when we can, but we're less involved in the process from the moment of acceptance onwards. Certainly at Evolution Letters, I think Tracey would say the same for Evolution. I don't know about the other journals, but I suspect similar.
I'm told the biggest delay post-production is production people saying we need modifications to your figures, and then the authors take a very, very long time to get the modifications to the figures in.
So we have a question here kind of about the future of publishing and what does that look like? So there's been a lot of recent changes in this area, preprints, preprint reviews, sites like Sci-Hub, and just move to completely online journals, open access. So what are your kind of thoughts on where the future of publishing is going and what that means for researchers?
You've got a lot in there. there's a lot of things to discuss. I mean, well, just focusing on lots of distinct things. I mean, one change which is coming up is Plan that you mentioned. I think Plan S, Coalition S, which is a move to make any author who's received funding from partners who, from funding from organisations that have signed up to this Coalition S, then they have to publish in an open access way. So either in a fully open access journal or in a subscription journal, but where the version of the manuscript can be made available on some other repository, or in a hybrid journal, but which is under what's called a transformative agreement. So which is a move to take away the money from the sort of subscription side and put it towards the open access publishing side. And so, so this is a movement that started mostly in Europe. There's a lot of signatories across the whole of Europe to this whole Plan S and Coalition S, make everything available to everybody. But also now, Bill and Melinda Gates, I mean, lots of the charity big funders are also signed up, signatories of this, and there's increasing interest across in the United States as well about this movement, about making all papers completely open access, partly as a function, I think, maybe minds have been focused because of the COVID pandemic too, the need to make important research widely available immediately to everybody who might want to read it. And so this is a huge change, and it will have a lot of ramifications for publications of publisher owned or society owned journals that are published by the big publishers, by learned society owned and published journals. So it has a lot of ramifications for the whole of the future. Now, I haven't really said what I think about that. You'll have noticed I've just been trying to outline what the situation is for means of clarity, but there are a lot of changes that are happening and coming quickly as well. So the idea at the moment is that this will be in place from the 1st of January 2021, which seems horrifically close. So I think I mean in general, I think we can sign up to the principles of being of open access, open research, wanting to increase transparency and making the results of research available to anybody who wants to read it. But it's my concern. Much of that's been driven from a sort of dissatisfaction, perhaps, with the perceived or actual profit margins made by the large scientific publishing houses. That's where a lot of that disquiet comes from. But I do have a concern about what this does for learned societies that publish the journals that we are editors of. in terms of the ability to fund all of the things that we do and that we really value, you know, giving money for people to come to conferences, to sponsoring education outreach, increasing diversity and equity and all of those issues. So, you know, it's a kind of, it's important to be aware of what's going on and to read about it, I think, but all of the solutions are far from being clear. I think I'd better stop now.
This is definitely an area that we as editors have been talking to each other about for a couple of years now. And yeah, it's a big source of concern. Personally, I'm most worried about actually junior scientists who don't have a lot of money to spend on publishing. If you're a member of Evolution or you're a member of ECR or the American Society of Naturalists or SysBio, SSB, you can get published for comparatively little cost. And if MNAT had to go to a strictly open access pay-to-play system, granted there aren't NSF dissertation improvement grants anymore, but it used to be you could get, you know, $12,000 to do your dissertation research from NSF. 5 years from now, that'll cover the cost of 2 of your publications and no research expenses. And I think what that does to people with marginal funding to do research, it's going to create a huge barrier to entry for you young scientists and for underfunded scientists, and that is a massive concern. So I'm a huge proponent of the hybrid systems where, yeah, if you have the money to do open access, we're happy to support that. But if you don't, we want to be a subscription managed system as well so that we can support you if you don't have the money to publish.
So I'll just chime in. You know, the question was about the future of publishing. And I hope that in the future, it's much more directed by scientific societies, rather than having us be in a position where we're trying to respond to market forces and respond to multinational companies and respond to all of the stuff that's going on in the publishing industry. My extremely naive read of the history of science and science publishing is that scientific publications started as scientific societies developed and grew, and have over the last, I don't know, 40 or 50 years become more immersed in the commercial publishing world, and not always to the benefit of these societies. And so I think there's a growing awareness among people who are in societies, scientific societies, about how publishing works now. And I think there's some creative ideas out there that are trying to change certain aspects. And so the question for me, and I don't have the answers, unfortunately, but the question is, you know, how do we as members of societies figure out, you know, how to direct this process in the future so that it comes back around to we're publishing good papers that are available to scientists in a way that benefits the members of our societies.
John, Max, do you have anything that you want to add? We're right at our time limit, so if there's anything else you want to say. No, Evolution Letters is open access, right? So we're good. With that, I want to thank all of our panelists so much for giving your time to us. It's just been wonderful to have you. If you're okay with it, we will share your editorial emails with the people that joined today, and they can reach out to you if they have unanswered questions. But thank you all so much for joining us, even with the technical glitches that we had. Thank you to our moderators, and we really appreciate all of our attendees. We had up to 120 attendees, so that was really fantastic. So thank you all so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
My pleasure.